from wherever you are, and welcome to Let's Play Games. I'm John McFarland, Adult Services Librarian for National Public Libraries, and I hope you'll join me in learning or rediscovering some of the more common and uncommon games out there. We went into last time the game Axes and Allies, one of the most preeminent strategic games out there, and one of the first. So instead of going through an entire game of turns, I want to go into some special situations that you will encounter over the course of a game and how to resolve those particular issues. Let's get stuck in. So now that we've gone a little bit into the nuances of the time period and setup of the map, it's time to play. So we'll start with the Soviet Union here. And the first thing we're going to do is make a purchase of units. So this is where our IPCs really come into play. So Soviet Union has 7 here. And we're going to take a look at this mobilization zone, which has a little chart here that all players will be able to use. So they have 7. They can't make a bomber, they can't make a fighter, no battleship, no aircraft carrier, no destroyer. They can make a purchase of 2 infantry, a tank, a submarine, and a transport, if they really wanted to. I wouldn't recommend doing any of those in terms of transport. I would probably suggest using some infantry units. This is the backbone of the decision-making that you're going to have. But you don't get to immediately place it on the field. So what I'm going to do is, because I need an extra unit here, so I'm going to replace it with that little token that we talked about last. The gray is 1, the green is 3, and the red, which nobody has red at the moment, is 5. So I'm going to place that in the mobilization zone. So there's 2 infantry units that we're going to have. That's pretty simple as far as the early turn. That's the first phase of everybody's turn, is purchasing those units and placing it in the mobilization zone. Easy enough, right? Our next turn is combat. So the combat will be occurring before any other movement happens. So we're just dealing with the situation as is. Now we have to make some determination as to where the attacks are coming from. Now let's see here. I think what we're going to do is go from Russia, and we'll bring the tank, 2 of the infantry, and the plane. So we now know that it's going to be interesting to figure out what number of units will survive this. So we'll bring out this chart here that's attached to make it easy to view. So you don't have to commit everything. You get to decide what is brought over. Russia's the attacker here. So there's the attacker side. So we've got a tank, fighter, and 2 infantry. And then we'll bring the 3 infantry here. So that way we're all situated as to who is doing what. And as I mentioned last episode, dice rolls are a huge part of it. So let's do the dice rolls in order. We'll do the infantry first. There's 2 here. A 2 and a 3, so no hits there. The tank, so that's 1 hit. Now let's do the defender one. So we've only got 3. And that is 2 hits. So like that. So now we know that 1 of the tokens is out, which frees up a gray token for later, thank goodness. Now you have to decide the assigning of that hit. So we're going to take out 1 of the infantry. partially because I know that there's backup coming, which will be immensely helpful later. So you decide here to either press the attack or retreat. It is entirely up to you. We're going to go ahead and press the attack and see what happens. Oop. That will happen a lot with dice rolls. Just make sure everything goes back to where it's supposed to. All right, not some great rolls, but one hit, so we've at least got that going for us. And 2 here, and 2 hits. So this is a unlucky set of rolls for the Soviet Union. There are going to be 2 hits. We have to sign those in places. I'm going to do the infantry and the fighter. Those will be out. I'll lose 1 of these. And at this point, I'm going to choose to not press the attack any further. They'll retreat to Russia here. And the reason why I'm doing that is, let's say I did capture West Russia. It's able to be attacked from 2 different places rather than 1 between Eastern Europe and Ukraine. And it means it's more likely to be conquered. You can have those decisions as to how you want to move around. Now you have the non-combat move. So last time I talked about the circumstances of the world during the development of this map. Now I want to talk about how games like this can be used for tournaments. Game tournaments, especially among strategy games, are popular, competitive, both on and offline. There are usually yearly tournaments where people get together and play these games and play them for hours on end to be known as the best player for a particular type of game. Now, one of the ways in which you can implement some of this is also figuring out who plays as what and what the stakes are. You can actually make a game more balanced in the views of tournament rules by changing a couple of things here and there from the baseline rules. This is encouraged and welcomed as long as all parties are agreed to it. So this could be implemented with certain countries starting off with more resources, or certain countries starting off with fewer resources, or certain places are agreed to be neutral turf. Balancing of this affects tournaments in many ways, of which I'll get to that in a minute. So from here, you're making the choice for what units can be moved. As long as you have them on the board and they can appropriately reach a place by their movement speed, you can move them just about, well, anywhere you like. So let's see here. What choices are we going to make? Now, this is where this movement speed comes back to effect. So those units in Siberia can't immediately just scooch over. What I can do is move 1 of those units over into the Urals. But we'll keep 2 there because Manchuria has 2 here. And I don't see it as much of a risk. They could eventually try and go up towards Alaska, but you have to make sure that down here is completely safe before you attack anywhere like that as the Japanese player. You didn't get any added units, so nothing gets moved on the board. I'm going to move 1 of the infantry from Archangel. Give myself a little bit more squish room. And I think that's enough for 1 turn. I know that in general, I'm fairly safe. So for here, now is the point where I can bring in my units. I've got 2 infantry to place, and I can place it at any point where there is one of these industrial production spaces. So probably just going to bring, and we'll exchange this out. We'll make it 3. for here. So with a large board, this looks like a fairly imposing game. However, when you break it down to the production, then the combat, then the movement, and then collecting your rewards. So at this point would be when the 7 that I've talked about, that is when it would be collected. So the reason for this, just as a balancing, is let's say you capture a whole bunch this one turn and then lose it all the next turn, you still get the benefits from that initial capture. So as it stands right now, Russia will still have 7. In theory, they could have pressed for that West Russia unit, but I didn't want to lose any more than I already had, because if I lost that tank, I was going to be in some trouble. So as a net, not the greatest turn, not the worst. So from this point, it would pass to the German player, which has 12 IPCs. So now they're going to go back to this mobilization zone and think, okay, I could get 1 fighter, and that would be it. 1 bomber, and that would be it. No real point in that as it stands. You need a lot in order to have some of these units handy. Sea units, you could go for like a submarine, a transport, a destroyer. You could buy yourself an aircraft carrier, as in a single one. You can't afford a battleship yet. Technically, no one right now can. The US would have to take control of at least 1 of the battlefield units in order to even qualify for getting a single battleship. Hence why that 2-hit is so powerful and so cost heavy. But you can decide for yourself what units to place. Notice that the central core of Germany is the only place where we can really place units after we've mobilized them. So this is where the expanding out will be important. So as Germany, what I'm gonna do is I need to find some free units here. Let's move this token. Switching out tokens, much like in Risk, when you change out the larger pieces for the smaller pieces, this will happen with a fair amount of regularity. So we're going to do a tank, and we're going to do 2 infantry. Notice how their turn functions pretty much exactly as it did before. And I want to talk about real quick the sea engagements, because now, let's see, submarine can move 2. The battleship can also move 2. So let's see where kind of the connection points are. So that's Sea Zone 5 right here, which connects to 6. So if we're escaping, we're guaranteed to do 1. They could make it all the way to 9, or 9 could make it all the way to 6, but that would leave completely open space. And 6 just barely connects with 8 there. So if you wanted to, you could start off this with a heavy combat engagement, which I don't personally recommend, but that's what we're going to do for the purpose of this. So 6 into 8. We'll bring the submarine, and we'll have ourselves a large sea combat. So that'll be defender, that'll be attacker. So we'll do that. All right, this will be a battleship. This is a submarine. Submarine, and battleship. So notice they're even here, but similar to how the infantry is on land, it's actually the reverse for sea battles. So I agreed to talk about the tournament style rules, and I will talk more about the 1942 version of the game because that's the most popular tournament, even though I have 1941's map. The biggest changes to it is usually there's room for an Italian player, which does and does not occur at multiple points, and there's balancing of some of these victory points. Notice that on our map it goes up to 25. In the 42 version, it can go up a whole lot higher. Another big change is there's a couple of country changes around here. Hawaii is allowed to take a significant more importance, so occupying the Hawaiian Islands is a viable strategy for the Axis team players. But for here, it's also about the bidding rules. So for bidding, typically in tournaments, it's a back and forth process. And it's almost like a spotting handicap of these IPCs, the production, of saying, okay, you know, we're going to win, but we're going to spot you 5 or 7 at the beginning. So that way it raises the stakes for how you are going to be able to disperse units. So whenever somebody has agreed to those rule sets, that will determine the stake of the game. Why would you do this? Well, it means that there is a specific win condition, and there's also a fun time limit. In tournament rules, you have a time limit of 4 hours and 45 minutes to complete this whole process. So, a couple things to make note of. First of all, the air units. So the air units have a little bit different movement rules. In taking off, technically counts as 1 movement, but since the fighters have 4 movement, that means they can technically make some quick moves. For example, let's add that Russian fighter back. So let's say we were dealing with an attack on, actually we'll move it to Archangel for this example. Let's say we were going towards Norway and Finland. This fighter being here, since it has a movement of 4, can actually attack all the way across the territory and back, as long as it has somewhere safe to land, which would be that territory. So for here, as a part of an attack, you get to determine what units are being moved there as an overall plan. So you can go from different angles. It's just a matter of where it's going to finish, and then those units are going to have to move. So let's say we went into that combat. The fighter would actually get the opportunity to not even have to engage in the combat. You could just say, I'm taking my fighter and I'm going to attempt a hit on Norway and Finland right there. So you can say, okay, you know, there's only so much you can do there, but if there's another fighter, you have an aerial combat. So we'll just roll 1 die here as the example. As the attacker, that didn't hit. They needed a 3 or less. The bomber, on the other hand, notice it has an attack of 4. It only has a defense of 1, so you have to be very careful with this. In this version of the game, there's no anti-air unit. In other games, like the 1942 version, there is, so you'd have to do this a bit more caution. But you can use this UK bomber here. Taking off would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so they could get back. Taking off 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the UK unit in taking off, which counts as 1 movement, could do 1 attack on the German core right here. And let's see what happens with that. That is 1 hit. But the risk, if you don't send that fighter along with, we'll have the fighter, which has an attack of 3 or less. It would actually take out that bomber. That's the risk you would have to take, but it can move through hostile territory as though it is friendly territory. Another thing to discuss is the concept of the blitz. So the tanks are actually allowed as a part of their 2 movement. They can move, let's say this tank is, we'll have it go through Archangel here, we'll move it to Norway, Finland. Let's say this was unoccupied, the Karelia, and then Archangel was also something to be occupied. You're actually allowed to blitz it all the way through, taking control of the territory and then being able to attack that subsequent region. So aside from some of these choke points, you can use that to your advantage to actually move faster through territory and dig a little deeper. It also helps the Soviet units when they want to go after, say, Eastern Europe. Because if West Russia had been left empty and it wasn't filled by anything on the next turn, they could blitz all the way through. So it's some of those movements that are niche, interesting ones. We also need to talk about the amphibious invasions. So a transport can hold an infantry and 1 other unit. So it can be an infantry and a tank, or 2 infantry units. So you would make the movement to actually load them up on a turn and then be able to subsequently move them on a future turn. So we're going to go ahead and use, let me find a transport here. Let's say we're towards the end game and we are doing the equivalent of the D-Day invasions. So let's be a little better about this and bring in a battleship for fun. They have the transport here. So we'll bring all of this business. So it gets a little crowded sometimes, but we've got 2 transports carrying 3 units. I'm presuming that they would be working on more. So with the way that combat works, so I'm going to bring this over here. Here's our infantry. Here's our infantry. Our battleship. And we're going to leave the transports in another spot. So we're going to move it off to the side here. The transports cannot absorb hits until basically they're the last ones, which you wouldn't want to do anyways, because if your transport sinks, so does your units, which means you lose 2 units for the price of 1, which you may not necessarily want. Fighter, and then what I got over here. We're just trying to move everything we can over. So from here, this is where all of the dice rolls come into play, them trying to invade Western Europe. So here's the 2 infantry. Close. The tank and the fighter. Got 1. Bomber and the battleship. 2. So 3 hits. And then for the defender side, we'll do the infantry first. 1. And then 3. So a total of 3 hits. So you would still apply the combat for each of these individual items. So the 2 hits mean that we'll take the infantry ones out. And then for this, we got to apply the 3. So the battleship can actually absorb 1 of the fighter hits. That is a technical benefit here because it's considered part of that engagement. And then from there, you can decide to take out, let's say, the infantry. I'm presuming you'd bring more than 2, but for the purposes of this example, you could. That allows you to press the attack. That'd be 2 hits, which would be enough. Now let's see that over here, which would actually be 2 hits. So this would be a lot in terms of losing units in combat. That's why building up progressively and taking away people's units more and more over time bringing a large force rather than just a small one is going to be so important as you get towards the end of the game, because at that point, you would take Western Europe. That would be 18. That would be 9. Now you've got more to do with, and you can cash that 18 in at the end of your turn, as long as you have things that will reinforce it. So over the course of this game, as on a balance, this ends up being a very strategic game. You have to work with your teammates in order to make this work. And also, one important thing about what we would call multinational invasions, I'm afraid we can't have on one turn. It's not like you can combine the UK's forces with the US's forces to do the D-Day landings as happened historically. It has to happen on your individual turn. So we could have the US person successfully invade, and as long as they hold it, the UK person could come in and help liberate that territory. But you can't specifically do the invasion together. So you're going to work cooperatively as the allies. I'm sure the Axis will work cooperatively as well to try and do certain things. But this would be the way that it would work with your teams respectively to try and win the game as fast as possible. In a nutshell, that's Axis and Allies. I would be remiss talking about a strategy game that's competitively played without talking about the internet. This is actually one of the first games that I ever saw had a back and forth online game set. You would actually be able to use file types or imagery of the board as is, and you'd be able to use it on internet forums, where each post would be a different turn as played. The resolution of those was the fun part. You had to list out the moves, and then somebody neutral would say, okay, here are the various results of that, and be able to continue to play each subsequent element, because you had the ability to press on and attack at any point. But this meant that it moved a little bit slower because you had to deal with that active turn. But these games still moved fairly quickly, only the course of maybe a couple of days. Now with modern connectivity, we have less forums and much more an active play session where games can take over the course of maybe an hour or two now. No setup, no cleanup needed. All you have to do is play. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to check back next time when we go into yet another game that you probably will enjoy. Be sure to check out some of our other great content on the NPL Universe tag. There are previous episodes of the Let's Play series, as well as story times, cooking hours, author talks, you name it. Also, National Public Library now actually lets you check out board games. Be sure to check out our board game collection where you can find this as well as many other games out there. I'll see you next time.